Morning, everyone. FHIR Work Group for today on the 21st. I'll be chairing this meeting and Brett will be our scribe. I'll just go through the agenda. So first off, we're looking to approve the minutes of our last FHIR Work Group meeting, and they were sent round for review. We've got updates on actions, those things we're still tracking as actions and the new ones that popped up from our last meeting. We've got the patient internal identifier to re-examine. That's the one we were looking at in our last FHIR Work Group, and there were some actions out of that to revise that draft and bring it back to this call for approval. There is a something that's come across from AU Core where there has been consideration to move some of that guidance from AU Core into AU Base because it's not AU Core specific. There's also an action item that came out of a recent AU patient summary call to discuss patient.gender and also gender identity and the relationship between those extensions. We've got this item, which is on the backlog for AU Base. There's also the medication strength discussion. There's internal extension for time zone. Brett, can I confirm that you do have that draft there that's ready for us to review today?
Yeah, that's ready to review.
Okay. We've got alternate binding preference for manifestation. That's Matt Cordell. I haven't checked if Matt can be at today's meeting, so we might not be able to go through that one, and I might need to speak to him offline and tee up whether or not he can come to the next one. Then we're on to this one. And that looks like that has a branch ready to go as well, Brett?
It does have something to review. Yep.
Okay. And then down is something that's been referred to from the AU Core TDG to consider AU Base Encounter and how we would link healthcare service to that. Now, for those people who are here, is there anything else they want to add to the agenda or anything that is just theirs but that they can't speak to today? All right. Does anyone have to leave early and we need to bump up their particular item? Okay. There's nothing else. Let's get cracking into this agenda then. So first up is the minutes for approval. I'll just open those. There's no outstanding feedback I'm aware of. It has all the required parts coming down to minutes. I'll just run through that quickly for people. Does anyone need more time to review this before we look to approve? Hearing nothing, who would be happy to motion approval of these minutes?
Sure, Dad McKillop.
Thanks, David. Looking for a second.
Brett,
Do you want me to
second?
Okay, Brett.
Yep, I'll second.
Okay, so David motion, Brett second. Any other comments or questions while I move to find the electronic vote? Okay, I'll just put up that vote. Please vote affirmative, negative, or abstain. I've just got the attendees up here if you want to try and remember if you were here. Okay, I'm going to count that down in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I will end that poll and share the results. Brett, were you able to vote?
Yep, in chat, +1.
Okay, +1. So with that, that is 6 affirmative, 0 negative, 3 abstain. The motion carries. The minutes are passed. Okay, on to our next one. Let's go through actions. We can start at the top. Marika, did you want to talk to medication strengths?
Yes, so I have just raised a JIRA. Apologies that there was just a little back and forward between Ruben and I, but I've just raised a JIRA number 50945. So basically, in summary, when we went to Zulip, there was some really good discussion that was engaged. In general, it seemed like people were in support of having the ability to represent the strength as free text at both levels, both the medication and also the ingredient level. But we originally were considering expanding the definition of the existing extension to allow it at both levels. What actually came out of the discussion was a recommendation that we pre-adopt the R5 ingredient.strength.codable concept, which actually made much more sense than us creating our own thing. So it looked as though when I added an additional poll to that, everyone was in support of adopting the R5 concept. So the JIRA that I've raised basically has two parts, and there's an additional point of discussion from Ruben that we thought we would bring to the floor. So the first proposal is pre-adopt the R5 concept for medication.ingredient.strength and just the codable concept component, because that is a choice data type, so that we can support the free text representation. And the second part of that is just updating the existing extension guidance to point to the pre-adopted R5 concept when we're desiring to represent that information at the ingredient level. Ruben, would you like to talk to, because I've just added a comment from our emails.
Sorry, before we go further, because this one isn't, this particular JIRA or approving this isn't on the agenda yet today.
Yep.
The update on the action is, and we might need to
We can
hold Ruben's comments to when we go to discuss the JIRA itself.
Yep, cool, sounds good.
Which, can I ask, does that mean, would you guys like to put that on the agenda for the next meeting?
Absolutely, unless Ruben has any objections.
Assuming that meeting doesn't conflict with Dev Days or the Open EHR event in Amsterdam, I'm happy for it to be at the next FHIR meeting, though I do suspect it probably will conflict.
So that's the 4th, Wednesday the 4th.
Yeah, I'll be in Amsterdam then, so unlikely I'll be able to make it. If it can be held off until the following one, I'll definitely be able to make that one.
Cool, I'm happy with that. I'm happy to wait until Ruben is back to be part of that discussion.
We could also see if we can add it to this agenda if there's time.
Happy with either
Right.
option.
Thank you.
No worries. Marika, there's a couple of others, or at least just this one on you that we're having a look at. So while you're giving us an update.
So I think that one's actually best for Richard to speak to. I had followed up with him and he was going to go away and start having a look at what could be done. Richard, can you speak to that?
Yep, I can, and I've not got anywhere with it. Other things have been jumping up and grabbing my attention away from it. So apologies, no progress.
Okay, we'll carry that over to the next meeting. Next one, Michael. Did you want to speak to the ones against your name? Michael Osborne, sorry.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Cool. Yeah, so I have got a draft branch for a coverage type, code system, and value set.
Have you raised a JIRA?
There's 2 JIRAs, and there's the original JIRA that was raised by Andy Bond. There's ballot feedback or something, I think. Yeah. Oh, you want the JIRA numbers? Just a minute.
No, that's okay. We can, if you've got proposal ready, which the action is to have a proposal, then we can, if you want to add that to the next FHIR Work Group meeting agenda, we can go through those at that meeting.
Yep, sounds good.
All right. Michael and Ruben, we're still tracking the SPCU as an action. Can you speak to these 2 bullet points and where we're up to on these?
I'll jump
So
in.
the question,
Michael, you
you
go
jump
ahead.
in. No, you go, Ruben. So
Well, I was just going to say that I haven't worked on this since our last meeting, mainly because I was in Madrid. I guess what's next is on me to sort of pull collateral together for the discussion ongoing. Did you want to add anything there, Michael?
no, I think that's fine. Yeah, I think last meeting it was you walked through the questions and answers around the thing.
Yep.
And
Yes.
yeah.
So Danielle, can I just check, is the idea going forward then that I sort of pull together a slide deck similar to what we did for the other gender harmony elements and I guess a proposal for what we'd be doing to introduce this in AU base?
I think that's where this is up to, is we're tracking
Yeah.
the action to prepare the proposal. And once we do, I think we stop tracking the action and we just put
Yeah.
the proposal on the agenda.
Yeah, great. That's my understanding. So I'm happy to do that probably in not the next FHIR Work Group meeting, but the following one.
Okay, how about we stop these two and we track Ruben to submit the proposal.
Yeah, perfect.
All right. Okay. The FHIR Work Group co-chairs to triage backlog items and follow up with requesters. Brett, I think this is done. Is there anything else that's outstanding on this one?
Oh no, I think we're just in BAU at the moment.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I think we've done the basics. Yeah.
And so out of that, some people have withdrawn some of the older items themselves. I don't remember what they are, Brett, but some of those have gone from the backlog.
Yeah, there's a few stale tickets that were detected. They were the agency tickets basically, and they withdrew on some of those. There was one that was transferred to e-requesting because it was a service request related item and more in their domain. And there's a couple of other ones still around the ARPA extensions. So they remain on our backlog currently. We were looking to see if they would take ownership, but there's no action on that yet. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Brett. So we consider this one done now. Next one, myself and Andy. I haven't spoken with Andy, but Andy, if you want to contact me for when you want to schedule and lead an information session, I'll organize that with our Zoom and the calendar invites and so forth. When and if you're happy to undertake that.
Okay.
Next one, Brett, any update further on the licensing policy?
Only that there was no response to that little question about participation, so I think we need to probably
Wrong issue.
Oh, sorry.
I mean, that's
licensing. Yeah, licensing.
Yeah,
Sorry.
licensing.
Sorry. We'll do licensing first. So sorry, I'm answering that one. Licensing. I was hoping Ruben would follow up with the agency on. There's a couple of questions we had for some of the artifacts there to complete the licensing discussion. I know Ruben's been away, and so hopefully we can follow up on that. That's still remaining to be done. So when we get an answer on those, we'll be able to round up those tickets for the licensing. Yeah.
Okay, so that's looking on
In
track to
progress
be
still.
incorporated in time for ballot.
Yes, hopefully. Once we get
Awesome.
advice, it should be pretty quick. Yeah.
And then you were answering the next one?
Yes, the next one. Yes, there's been no response to that call for participation in a policy and conventions working party. I'm probably going to come back to the raiser of the ticket, which was Ruben, to be involved in that. And I might ask some of the Spark conventions, mainly the modelling facilitators, probably other key people to get involved in that as well. So I might tap some people to progress that since there's been no other kind of external participation indicated.
All right, and last one. Out of our last meeting, we agreed to move the AMT medicinal products and substances value set, and I was just looking to Michael Osborne to give us an update on the actions that have come out of this.
Yep. So I created a ticket for NCTS for that one. Unfortunately, it didn't make the sprint, so I didn't make the May release, but hopefully it will be in the June release.
Okay, thanks, Michael. So those are our updates. Are there any other updates that aren't actions that we need to go through? All right, then let's move on to the AU Patient Internal Identifier. Will you share your screen, Michael?
I can share my screen, yeah.
Stop sharing.
Okay. So just a quick recap. So there was this Zulip chat, which we got quite a lot of nice information about this profile. And then there was a decision made that a small group of us, mainly the people that posted on this, would get together, which we did yesterday. So that included Angus, Richard, myself, and Heath, and Brett. And we had an hour-long discussion, and we came up with a bunch of stuff that we wanted to put into the profile notes, which I'll just show you now. So if you can see that, I'll just make it slightly bigger. So has anybody that was on that call yesterday had a chance to review what I've done?
I've had a read of it. Yep. I like the thrust of it. I think it needs more work, but I like the general thrust of it.
Okay, so in particular, just so I can take some notes, is there anything you'd add or subtract from it?
Let me think now. No, not at the moment. No, nothing clear enough to have all the people listen while I form my thoughts. So no.
That's okay. So I'll just quickly summarize what's changed since we looked at this last time. So the assigner is now it's a cardinality change to required. All of the wording around system has now changed to application. So you'll see that it's unique within an application, so not within a system.
Okay.
Okay, and even down here, system identify namespace for the application that assigned the internal patient identifier. And then we added these usage notes. So these, and we added a difference between, why you'd use a PII versus an MRN. So this text here. I'll open, Brett's got his hand up.
I do. I'm not sure the example Jason adds any value and maybe a bit too prescriptive in terms of people might think that is indicating how they should do it, where I think we just kind of want to be a little more vague, which I think the sentence kind of covers things to think about, but I'm not sure it's helping to have a example like that. That's all.
Yep, cool. So that's an example that Heath gave me, which I thought was quite good because it talked about down to the instance level and stuff like that. Anybody else have feedback on that?
I think we've got an interesting dilemma on this part of it. One thing is, if you're just going to provide general guidance, then a bunch of this stuff you can provide even less guidance and say, it's an identifier, do something sensible and identifier-ish. And on the other hand, maybe you've got other people who really want some examples. And so the two actually pull you into two different directions. I'm not sure what the solution is.
Andy?
I'm going to walk the same line Richard is. I understand the need, but I don't know whether this is entirely helpful. That description of the PII saying is assigned with an application or application instance. If that's being distinguished, what do you actually mean by an application? The application type. So all instances of an application versus a single application, and then kind of saying it's kind of implying you shouldn't share this, but if you have to, you can. But I don't know whether that is. I think we kind of need to say example scenarios in which it's that you might consider it, because it kind of doesn't help me make a decision.
I think the difficulty with this one is because vendors have different ways of identifying patients, and you've got cloud-based single tenants, multi-tenants, local servers. Each one's got a different scope for identifiers, and it's very hard to put that into words in usage notes.
Noting that's what the FHIR standard does on the identifier data type.
Thank you.
So I think what we've got here is a small subset of the really good explanation that's in the FHIR standard, including the whole there's servers, there's applications, there's these other things. I think if we're going to pull out a couple of things to show people, then we would need to, and that's kind of almost a point of order for AU base, describe a scenario, have an actual example and link it to it. We don't do profile specific implementation guidance with these kinds of snippets. So we would need to rejig that for the formatting of the standard anyway. But what you could do if you did have an example you wanted to show, which is already in the FHIR standard anyway, about, hey, there's a PAS server or this other kind of thing, then you could name examples that do that and include it. Though that's always a risk of there's an interpretation of people saying, oh, that's how I should do it since I have this type of application. Yeah.
But isn't the scope, like an application is one scope that you could choose to do that within, but an organization might choose a broader scope, so that the definition of internal then is really relative to what an organization infrastructure chooses to do. And I think is, you said, Michael, that in cloud-based systems, like the concepts of application instances are actually they're not really meaningful. It's actually about a scope defined by the internal to an organization, and that organization, it's up to that organization to define what that's going to be. This kind of says you can only do it within an application. But I don't know whether that is necessarily a constraint that we want to imply.
I think it flat states that, and if it's not true, then we do need to reword that. If it isn't to be unique to an application or application instance and can have a broader scope, then there does need to be some adjusted wording.
Yeah. So
One of the things
isn't it just an MRN at that point?
Yeah,
Well,
one of the things that
to
seemed
me,
to come up in the meeting yesterday was sort of the difference between identifiers where there's enough sophistication that they've got a good system and they've got a good value for identifier.system, and they've got good control over the fact that the identifiers are what set they belong to. And then you've got identifiers which are just being used by a small part of a large organization, and they don't really have a good grasp on how to have a good value for identifier system. And we want to somehow let those people who aren't very sophisticated about finding a value for identifier system share their identifiers, and that's what these PI identifiers are. That was one of the sort of scenarios that I picked up on yesterday. And so that sort of situation and problem is, in fact, a slightly different sort of problem to what is easy to do with MRNs and PIIs.
So can we get confirmation that it is intended to be only within the scope of an application or application instance and wouldn't service what Andy was raising about a potentially wider scope? Or does there need to be adjustment?
Well, Angus has joined us and he's certainly got opinions on this, I think.
I was just trying to find the email I sent to you in a sec. So sorry, can you say that question again, Danielle?
I'll pass over to Andy to ask propose that it's not just restricted to application or application instance.
Well, yeah. Well, go on, Andy. Go on.
I was just commenting that in the day, in current kind of cloud-based systems, concepts of applications, application instances and stuff, they don't really have as much meaning. And I think that the scope of the identifier is defined by an organization and managed by an organization. You know, I think Rich is kind of getting at the issue that the MRNs are more formally defined and the PIIs are more informally defined. And that's really the only distinguishing feature. I know there's a whole bunch of carryover from V2, but in V2 didn't have the formalisms around the scopes and stuff that we have in FHIR. So I don't know whether trying to kind of latch on to applications as a foundation for this necessarily is going to make sense.
Can you tell me something that it doesn't cover? Because I feel like application covers your use case where Gen 2 is an application, even though it's servicing many facilities, just as best practice on-prem is an application servicing one facility. I feel like the word application covers both. What doesn't it cover?
Platform services. So whether there's a platform service that's shared across multiple applications that manages a namespace, then is the application the platform? That just gets a bit kind of.
I think you're splitting hairs. So you know, a platform is like Facebook's probably a platform, but everyone would consider it an application. LinkedIn,
Okay.
you know, like
can you suggest an alternative term, Andy? Because we're trying to stay away from the term system as much as we'd love to use the term system.
Well, it comes back to internal and what does internal mean? And if it's internal to an application, then yes, it's defined by the application scope. But if it's internal to an organization, which is, I think, the intent of an internal identifier.
It's not the intent.
No, the intent is.
Well, I think that needs to be. That needs to be the basis of it, because.
Well, that's what the definition actually says. It is within an application. That's exactly the definition. I mean, even if we went back to the original HL7 FHIR definition for this concept, it's along those lines. I'll have to pull it out again from yesterday's conversation.
Yeah, I think most people would refer to Gen 2 as an application. Even you might try to define it as a platform.
Yeah, I'm not saying that there aren't instances that fit application. I guess I'm saying that there are where something exists across multiple applications, because the identifier is of a broader definition, then are we saying it can't be a PII because it's not associated with a single application?
I think your platform concept is a valid use case, and it's whether we want to come up with a generic term for application and platform, or literally use the words application and platform. So yeah, I mean, there's an element of splitting hairs, but I get what you're saying.
Okay, can we just take a note there that we might need to expand then the list of, for example, that may address it? if it isn't, if we feel that the definition of application is sufficiently expansive, but that it might not be quite understood by everyone, and you can do that by listing some more examples, that's possible. I am going to come to the people with their hand up, though, before we circle back to this conversation, noting I'm going to want to time box this discussion to over the next 15 minutes. We have other items on this agenda that might actually get through, and I'm concerned that we are stalling on this item. Brett, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, I think clarifying the meaning of application would help. I think if I think of application in the sense of a V2 message application, that's kind of what we're talking about. So it's about, I think it implies that there's a managing system that is allocating these things and controlling these things, and whether that's a platform or whether that's a particular like user application, I think is a something to clarify. But so I think maybe some language around defining the application would be helpful. Like Danielle says, maybe some examples of different kinds of ways to refer to that.
Okay, so far to summarise, and then we'll go to Ruben. There's been the question on the table from Andy on, is this too restrictive? Angus and Heath have said, well, no, we think that actually works, but we could explain that better, and that's where Brett is at. Ruben?
Thanks. I guess I'm kind of agreeing with Brett here. I think we need a bit more description and clarity and examples of how this will actually be used. I note in the usage note, it says it can be assigned within an application or application instance, which kind of suggests that this can actually be something that's assigned at vendor level rather than user level. So I think there's some questions which I think need to be answered before we can proceed with this. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Ruben. Heath?
So just going back to the definition of this, it is they use the term assigning authority, which is obviously very HL7v2 terminology, which I think we talked about yesterday as basically being extremely abstract, and no one actually knew what that really meant unless you lived HL7 for 20 years. So hence why we're trying to find a different term that's a little bit more relatable.
Thanks, Heath. So in terms of the interest of time, I think it's clear that what is being asked for is further clarification of application. I think we've got some notes here. Can I ask us to move on to other parts? Is there anything else that we would look to adjust before we would approve this proposal, besides making clear application and its scope? Heath?
I just want to put it out there that I'm still questioning whether we really need another profile / identifier type over and above the medical record number, because I've gone back to some Zulip chats where people like Graham and more specifically Lloyd have basically said, oh, anything that's related to a medical record number is a MR.
Thanks, Heath. Now, Angus, did you want to speak? I know your hand was up briefly.
Yeah, I had two things, and a comment against what Heath just said. So, from what Heath just said, I'm worried that I get medical record numbers and a PI, and now I'm lost as to which one's the PI. So trying to know which one it is, without having to dynamically work out, who is this coming from. But I'll put that aside for the moment. I had two other points. One is just the example you've got for system. I just felt the use of the domain name example.system was a bit vague, and thought maybe that should be literally the word software-provider.com to align with the sentence above. And also the last part, identifier type. Well, I think the example should be something like patient ID, because that's what that would be an example where really what you're giving me there is sort of like this syntax line. And my last point was the second dot point below the example, where it says a patient internal identifier is an identifier for patients assigned within an application or application instance, I felt it weird what the next sentence says. It is not intended to be widely shared. And appreciate that we probably said this a few times in the meeting before, but I mean, this is an interoperable standard, right? So it's hard to say it's not intended to be widely shared. I had suggested words in like, it is not intended to be broadly shared beyond the consuming applications. So to say, you know, it's in this message for the consumers of this message, but the consumers of this message should not pull that identifier out and put it into some other message sent to somewhere else externally.
Noting, Angus, this is FHIR, not V2. So we can't assume a messaging paradigm.
Sorry, I shouldn't have said, I'll rephrase that without the word message.
And you can't assume that intention.
Well, it can, because you create a resource, you put it in a FHIR server for its intended use. You don't expect someone to read in that FHIR resource, take that identifier out, put it into some other resource for some other context.
I think the point is that it's really intended for point-to-point kind of transactions, like what Angus is looking for it to be in the e-requesting kind of scenario, so that when he sends something back with the same ID, they know where to put that back into the requesting system.
Okay, so we have two items here to address. One is the clarification of application. Actually, there are three items. One is the clarification of application. The other is the second or third bullet point, or however, the bullet point that is the one that Angus was talking about, where he has some suggested wording. And I will echo the requirement to change the formatting here and the example. We do not, in an editorial sense, support snippets in this view in profile-specific implementation guidance, and every inclusion is expected to have an example. I will also note maturity level must be 0. It is not AFMM 1. This is AFMM 0 at this point in time.
So what do you mean by the snippets? You mean there should
we do
be
not put, yeah.
There should be an example, but not a snippet. Sorry?
Correct. Like there should be an actual example for every inclusion in AU base. And we have that for just extensions and other things. And we can describe content, but we don't do long pages of code snippets. Profile-specific implementation guidance is a short series of bullet points above a formal definition. If you need to make it into a whole guidance page with complex instructions, which it seems like there might actually be some interest in doing later on, that would go into a guidance page so that we don't clutter up things before people get to the formal definition of the profile.
Can it go below the formal definition, i.e. the notes down the bottom?
No.
Well, we have snippets for things like search parameters and stuff.
No, you don't. If you want to go to the FHIR artifacts for search parameters in AU base, we absolutely do not.
We do in AU core though.
The AU core profiles have a set of, and that's for an IG that has a set of RESTful API to describe where that is. But AU base doesn't have a RESTful API set of controls on identifier.
I guess it's down to the scope of the guidance. As you said, if it was broadly across all identifiers, then that makes sense to be in a broader guidance. But if it was specifically for this particular identifier,
I disagree, and I guess we're taking up time here. If you're actually creating a whole page, which is a complex page where someone needs to read, that should be in a guidance page, which will allow you to do like multiple snippets and talk about all sorts of things and do back and forth. It doesn't just have to be across more than one profile. So there's some fixing there, and I'll provide some specific editorial notes to Michael Osborne. It wouldn't reduce the fact that you would have system or value. They just wouldn't be presented in that format. Are there any other things? Is there anything normative about this profile that people want to change? Or are we happy with the normative and it is about the informative content? So if you scroll down, Michael.
So to your point, Heath, it would retain, if we were not to have this, we'd lose the PI type, wouldn't we? If we, on your point of like questioning whether we don't have this at all and we just have a medical record number, we would lose the PI type, wouldn't we?
That's right. The conversations that have been had is that basically any patient identifier that relates it to a medical record is AMR type. And you can have lots and lots of them scoped by system.
Mm.
And the way that you know which kind it is through the system. But
how do you know which
at a
ones
very high level categorization of it, it is just a medical record number.
But we wouldn't be closing off what identifiers are chosen to use. It's just there wouldn't be a base profile of a PI.
Well,
yes, that's true. Sorry, just to go to that point, even whether or not we profile this doesn't actually prohibit its use in the profiles. I don't think has e-requesting locked down the type of identifiers to only be 1 or 2 for patients, or would this be allowed?
No.
But if you go to the binding on type, identifier type.
It's extensible. Yes.
Yep. So if you go there, it's extensible. Yes.
I'll put it in the chat.
But the value set is actually very limited. And that is also what is referred to, or even though it's extensible, get that. But it's a very short list of identifier types.
I've got the link in the Zoom chat, Michael.
I guess my concern is, and probably wrongly or rightly, is I would assume a resource only has 1 PI in it, where it would have many MRs.
Why would it have only 1 PI?
Because there's not 2 systems creating the patient resource. Like
an aggregator or a HIE might, but yeah.
Yeah. Like, yeah, like see, an aggregator shouldn't. It's kind of like what we're trying to get to about not sharing it, right? Like if I'm hitting an application like Gen 2, there should be 1, right? And yet there might be many medical record numbers from different hospitals. But as soon as I hit 2 PIs in one resource, now I'm like, well, you're now sharing it, like, which is not the intent.
Okay, Brett?
I think going back to Angus's point, like, I think there's a conceptual difference between the medical record number and the PI. And like, I think it's obviously in use in the real world with that distinction. So I don't see why we wouldn't have a profile to help make that distinction clear.
I think it's a fairly important distinction to the fact that one's more trustworthy than the other.
Why? Which one's more trustworthy, Mike?
Okay, guys, at this point, I think time box. We've talked about this for 15 minutes. Additional, we've got a set of actions on to take away and adjust. Brett, who's taking the minutes, are you clear on what those actions are, or at least can redefine them from the transcript?
I'll do it from the transcript.
Okay.
Because there's a lot to unpack. Yep.
It is. Do we need to raise any other item on this one to provide the necessary direction for Michael Osborne to take the next steps? Or are we still just talking about the exact same items?
We just get together again.
Yeah. I'll organize another meeting.
Which I think was the plan.
Yep.
All right. So we'll look to put this one on the agenda for the next meeting. And I'll come back to where we are. Okay, so we've just discussed this one. we've got a set of actions. It appeared that we had no comments on the normative part of this and are really about the informative content surrounding it. Next one, which is coming from the AU Core TDG on moving comms press for patient to AU patient. Brett, I think you're speaking to this one. Did you want to share your screen, or will I share my screen and you direct me?
Could you share yours? That would be good. Thank you.
Okay. Did you want me to open the JIRA?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, cool. So I think, yeah, so this was a question that turned into a request. So basically, Andy might like to weigh in since it's his ticket. And it's basically just a question about the patient language, guidance on patient languages shouldn't there be something in AU Core to describe that specifically? And in AU Core, in the specific profile guidance, we do already have this section in AU Core, which is about usage of the language communication preferences in patient, and that has already been decided to also include related person, which is something that AU Core has also added recently. And the question that then came through from the co-chairs of AU Core is, shouldn't this really be described in AU Base, as it's not particularly AU Core specific, and would we consider adding this guidance in AU Base? And then AU Core could refer to it. So that's basically the ticket. So I think
this would be, I believe there is, part of this would be moving.
Yeah, I'm not sure we say a lot.
The guidance, because it exists and it is the same guidance, just not as pretty on a bunch of AU-based profiles. So the suggestion is to move out the guidance from AU-based patient and AU-based related person into this kind of formatting, and the AU Core should be referring to AU-base's section on it instead of repeating the guidance that is defined in AU-base, which is consistent with kind of where we've been going with making sure that AU Base has this content and then downstream IGs pointing back to it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, and I think there's nothing in that AU Core description there that's particularly.
It's not different. It's just
exactly.
better formatting, which is kind of going to, I guess, what I was talking about on the formatting of the other PR we were just talking about.
Yeah, and it is definitely relevant to related person, even though, yeah, as well. So like it is a shared description. So rather than repeating it in multiple profiles.
So is there a specific AU-based JIRA that you've raised?
No, there's not, but we could do that if people were amenable.
While you were showing patient, I saw the stuff there on gender. And that doesn't just belong on patient, that's elsewhere. So is this a story that's wider than just doing it on language, that that the sex and gender stuff needs the same sort of moving out of the individual profiles and putting into it? I mean, like we've got that there. So maybe, yeah, so that in a sense, this will wind up being like what we've got for sex and gender. And so, and likewise, the bullet point for it would be like the bullet point we have for sex and gender. It gives a little bit and it says, and go there if you want the details.
Yes, I think that's the intention, is to say, you know, go to this page, which is well laid out and has snippets in it and that kind of thing for how to see the content. Yes. Are there any
So I'm happy.
questions or comments on the suggestion that what's the more specific thing, that it becomes part of general guidance, that there's a section like there is in AU Core called representing communication preferences that covers the AU-based patient and AU-based related person taking this formatting and content over?
Yeah, that would be it. And so I guess the question is, do we want a specific ticket? And
we can create
come back
that
to it.
post this meeting.
Or do we just want to get an agreement and approve it?
I don't have a preference. We can either create a ticket, a JIRA post this, which we should do anyway, for the change log to represent the discussion and agreement, if an agreement is made in this meeting. Yeah.
Okay. So like Danielle said, the proposal is to take the content from AU Core. Representing communication.
In a sense, we've already got the content. It's just that we don't have it in a nice place that AU Core can refer to. So the thing is to put it in a nice place for AU Core to refer to.
And at this point, if we replicated what AU Core did, it would be a section under general guidance instead of a separate page. Are people happy with that, or would you like a separate page?
I'd be happy with it there because it's not super extensive.
Okay. Any other comments or questions?
I'm sorry. So, and we would update the specific guidance in profiles for patient and related person.
Yes. So, yep. Can you form a coherent motion, Brett?
Okay. So I'm proposing that we take the content from AU Core guidance representing communication preferences, replicate that in AU base general guidance as a section, and update the specific profile guidance in patient and related person to refer to that and inform the AU Core TDG that it exists. I so move.
Okay, we have a motion from Brett. Who would like to second?
I'll second that, Richard.
Thank you, Richard. Any other comments or questions on that proposal? Hearing none, I'm going to bring up the electronic vote. Okay, you should see that now for the current motion. All right, got about 70% of people, so I'm going to count that down. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'll end poll.
And I'm a plus
and yep.
Yep.
So with that, there are 6 affirmative, 0 negative, 4 abstain. The motion carries. And I'll take an action on myself in the minutes to inform the AU Core TDG of this change when it's in, so that they can progress the change in AU Core to refer to this guidance and inform them in a call. Okay, yes.
Just one thing on that. Practitioner also has communication, but it's sort of slightly different. It's like not how you talk to the practitioner, but it's how the practitioner can talk to others. So that may want to get rolled into this.
I don't think it's the same advice. Yeah.
I'll have a look. We'll have a look at that. It may need to be an enhancement because, as you've pointed out, it's a different nature. So I think it would also go on the page, but it might be because we don't have any existing profile specific guidance on what to do.
Yep.
So I
Yeah,
think
it
that would
doesn't-
more be an enhancement.
Yeah, it
Okay.
doesn't have the same backbone structure either, whereas related person and patient do.
But yeah, you're right, Richard. And if you would like to propose an enhancement during ballot, I think that would be fantastic.
Okay.
Okay, next item, and realizing we're running out of time, we've got another half hour, don't we? So just looking at this list here, are there any particular ones that will either be quick or that are high priority that we should get to that we can like complete in the remaining time?
I would like to do number 6 if I can, just because
Okay.
I think that one's not too controversial and we knock it on the head. We get into something.
Yep.
I think I'd like to do number 7 just because if we don't get to it today, it'll be a month before Ruben is back to talk to it.
Okay, so let's do 6 and then let's go to 7.
Cool.
Okay, 6, Brett, talk us through it.
Okay, so yeah, so this is a ticket that came up. This was actually, there was another ticket, which in which we relaxed some constraints on an observation profile, the diagnostic observation profile. And so that was approved in the last ballot. And so this new ticket was noting that there is another observation profile, which has a similar constraint on timing, and it was to also include relaxation of those. So this is so these are for the pathology and diagnostic imaging observation results, which have a constrained timing value. So it's in our observation profiles.
This is one of them. The other one's the same.
Yeah, similar,
Okay.
yeah.
Here.
Effective time. So you see, we've actually restricted the allowable types from the base profile. And I think being AU base as well, the intent would not be to do that, to allow the other types, which I think, so I think that was it. So since we're not a implementation specific profile, it was noted on the other observation profile that was an issue. So that was just to bring that up again.
Yes. So we would propose that
point.
is what's proposed. So if I do a proposed resolution, proposed disposition, it is to do the same thing as the other one. Relax observation.effective to allow date, time, period, timing, and instant. Okay, that's the proposed disposition. Any comments or questions?
Hang on, which profile is this on? Is this
It's on AU base pathology result and AU base diagnostic imaging result.
Okay, right, good, thank you.
Okay, I'm not hearing any other comments or questions. Would you like to make a motion, Brett?
Yeah, I'll make a motion that we relax these constraints on pathology result and diagnostic imaging result.
Okay, is there a second?
Sure, David McKillop.
David McKillop as second. Any other comments or questions? Okay, I will launch that poll. Okay, counting down in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'll end that poll. And with what is in the chat, we go to 9 affirmative, 0 negative, 1 abstain. The motion carries. We will go ahead and make that change. That was nice and quick. Okay, let's do medication strength. And then if there is time, I think there was the request from patient summary for, and there was an action there. So did you want to share screen, Marika?
Sorry, I'm technical issues. Probably better if you share screen, but if you go to the JIRA, so 50945. Cool. So just summarizing what I summarized earlier, but basically general consensus when we put it to the community in Zulup was that people were in favor of pre-adopting the existing R5 concept as opposed to expanding the original medication strength extension. So the first part of the proposal is pre-adopting that to represent just, it supports the free text representation at the ingredient level. And then the second part of the proposal is updating the existing extension, so the one that's linked medication strength, to provide guidance and say, if you want to provide information as free text at the ingredient level about the strength of those ingredients, here's the other extension that we recommend. Ruben did have some concerns whether or not there should be additional guidance that I'll let him talk to, but that initial part is the basis of what we're proposing, and then there might be some friendly amendments around if we need additional descriptions.
Okay, Ruben?
Thanks, Mika. Right, so my additional concern was whether this extension should have guidance which describes what the value of this extension should be if there are one or more instances of the ingredient-specific strength included in the same medication instance. Should it clarify what the strength is then referring to and or not? And I guess, yeah, I think just general guidance in relation to how this contrasts with the ingredient strength in general.
Thank you, Ruben. So that's a question. We'll open the floor on whether or not we should be describing how this extension works if it is both, if it's present and the pre-adoption is present. So there are instances of medication strength at both the parent and the ingredient level. Brett,
Yep.
Your hand is up.
Yeah, just from where it came from way back, I think it was intentionally not, we didn't want to introduce structured text, and we definitely can't test it in terms of what it is as a concept. And it was really to enable a strength to be stated without, as per a label, where there was no specific ingredient information. So I'm not sure if we want to go down the path of constraining it out if there are ingredient strengths noted, because it is something that I think is useful for consuming systems that want to display
Noting, Brett,
the
the question on the floor is whether or not we provide guidance. It was not, there was, I don't think, any suggestion that we add a normative constraint.
All right. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think at the moment, like, I don't think there's any guidance to latch onto, because I think that turns into a clinical question in terms of how should strengths be stated. So unless there's a formalization of that as guidelines, I don't think we should be weighing into that.
Well, if it is a clinical question, which I agree with, then I'd refer it to the CDG.
I think the specific question that was asked by Ruben is, if we are allowing, and we are, that's the proposal, for this extension to be at the medication resource level, the root level, and allowing the pre-adoption to be present at the ingredient, should there be guidance to describe what it means when you have both present in the medication resource?
I think I share similar concerns as Brett around if we put guidance around them, particularly because they're both extensions, so they're both optional and may not necessarily be present. And again, it's free text, so the use case to support that we're proposing this modification for is to support free text, and providing guidance there, I think, may limit the utility of the extensions or may make implementers question whether or not the extensions are appropriate, even if it's not a constraint. I think it's better to infer like what the use case is and what is defined from where the extension is applied. So a medication strength as free text at the resource level or at the ingredient level, I think is fairly clear. And I think, it just makes it tricky as an implementer.
Ruben?
Look, the first thing I want to flag is for the ingredient level strengths, they're only extensions because AU base is an R4 spec. So we're actually doing cross-version extensions here. They're actually native elements in R5 and will be in R6 as well. And they are, I think, very clearly defined in the base FHIR, in the core FHIR spec. My concern here is what consuming systems are meant to take from the strength if it's there, and there is one or more ingredient level strengths at the ingredient level. Clarifying the correct usage of this extension, I think, is pretty important, so that the wrong assumptions aren't made, or that multiple assumptions about its meaning are made by the implementer community. Now, we could take the easy way out here, and going back to what Brett was saying, and that was, if all this extension is meant to capture is the strength on the label of the medication pack, then we can state that semantic, and then there's no ambiguity. But in the absence of that, then people could make the wrong assumption about what this is, and we want to avoid that.
Okay, Brett?
Because I don't think, it was originally it was added particularly to handle the case where the code for the medication didn't include strength information, which it mostly does in AMT use. So it's so it really was a way to capture something
there's
that
more
was a gap.
complexity there.
And there's more complexity
what's
there.
in AMT is probably the basis of strength substance, whereas again, there are different kinds of strengths at play, including strength of a dose and things like that too.
And I think people also were stating, like, strength, sometimes they would only have strength included for the main active ingredient. Sometimes they would have strength for all the active ingredients. And so there was a lot of variability, I think, in what would actually be populated there. The only thing I would think it would be useful is to say you don't need this strength field if there is a fully defined code that includes strength, because it would already be stated in the code content.
That's one way, which I'm not completely opposed to. We could also say that you shouldn't mix and match ingredient strengths with this one.
Yeah, this one looks to be different to an ingredient strength. This is saying, I have a medication, and a case will be, I have medication, and I have in medication code, I've said what the medication is, but I have a piece of text that tells me about the strength. And I don't want to mix that with what I've got in medication code. So I need a place to put that strength information. And that's what it supplies. And that's a different thing to medication ingredient strength. do we still have the need for that? Because it seems to be it's doing a different thing to what medication ingredient strength is doing.
I think this
Well,
needs still exists, particularly with compounding. They may not necessarily put all of that information in individual ingredient. Just thinking about data structures that I've seen, that information may just exist as a free text. We've done this with all of these things. So I think that the need still exists for both extensions, but I think that they are very different.
So let's reframe. Part of what this proposal is because it's at AFMM 0, it's not a real AU-based thing yet. It's an idea we've got, and we're trying to get it to ballot readiness. To do that, we needed to confirm, do we want it? How does it work? And have an example and make a decision then that it is at AFMM 1. So I think we've answered the do we want it part quite satisfactorily through the set of actions. And I think we're now into the how does it work? I would say that there's been enough comment here and also in the Zulip chat to suggest that we do need some degree of guidance to explain how it works and how it works in combination or not in combination with this, which I guess brings us to I'll ask this first bit. Is there any dispute around the normative parts? Because again, we've got the let's clarify it. The proposal under discussion is that in fact we pre-adopt instead of extending this extension, we pre-adopt the ingredient strength codable concept from R5 and then keep this medication strength to be at the resource level. Does anyone have any concerns about that? Okay, so that seems quite clear that we're happy to go down that pathway. And it's now about preparing a set of guidance and maybe an example that will allow us to include that in AU base.
The guidance could be as simple as saying, note that this is at resource level, not ingredient level.
So can we take an action then maybe for Ruben or Marika to draft up what that guidance would be? I guess this point here.
Yep, absolutely. I'm happy to take the action on myself, but work with Ruben on it if Ruben's okay with that.
Yep, I'm good with that.
And then we can put this back on the agenda for the next meeting. I mean, if you're happy, Ruben, we can submit that to the FHIR Work Group to look at the guidance. And if we're happy, then we can approve the inclusion of that guidance and these normative aspects.
Sure.
All right. And it would be great if we could have an example, or maybe even more than one example, depending on what the guidance is suggesting how someone should use this.
Just confirming an example of the JSON object, like a medication resource.
Yep. Yeah.
Cool.
And then we would look to include those or something similar in AU base. All right.
That sounds totally doable.
Wonderful.
Thanks, Danielle.
Okay, so we've answered this one. We're pretty happy with 7, but we've got an action noted in the minutes to come back then and approve it in our next FHIR Work Group. Brett, do you think there's time to discuss this one?
There's probably time to get into it. I don't know about making a decision, but I don't think it's that complicated really, but it's
okay.
Yeah, we could I think that would be helpful for the patient summary group if we could.
All right. The reason this has come to the FHIR Work Group is there's an action coming out of an AU patient summary meeting. The last one Stephen and I were at, where it was looking at patient, which is mandatory in AU core patient. And the concern was around the potential, and I'll just go to the minutes on gender. that there was a concern that requiring the presence of gender, patient.gender, means that if all you have is gender identity, you would be forced to use the code unknown, and that there was a concern that this could be misleading or clash with the gender identity extension, and that shouldn't be supported. And the action was to bring this to the FHIR Work Group to discuss around the different gender values and whether this was a concern, because AU Base and this group is driving the consistent kind of how do all the things work together across all the projects. Stephen, did you want to talk to the concern? If you're speaking, Stephen, we can't hear you. Okay, Stephen's just working on the microphone. Ruben.
What I clarified, Daniel, is the ask here that the FHIR Work Group supports making gender optional in AU patient summary, and I guess thereby breaking conformance with AU core patient summary. I mean, AU core patient profile.
No, I think the ask is whether or not this actually is a problem, and that we need to therefore update the guidance in AU Base and proliferate that across everyone to say, no, you shouldn't be doing this, or we clarify that this is fine, and
Yeah.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I'll wait until after Ruben has finished.
Yeah. So it seems to me this, I guess, if we were to make it optional can I just clarify one more thing, Danielle? Is making it optional AU patient summary, does that then necessitate us making it optional in AU core as well?
There is an AU core JIRA that's raised and is intended to be discussed, and what we would look to inform that discussion is if the FHIR Work Group makes a determination that, yes, you shouldn't be sending at all patient.gender with unknown and a value in gender identity, that is actually conflicting, then we would provide that directive to AU core that they need to make a change.
All right. So on that basis, I think it's reasonable for that value to be unknown, and really we can provide as much guidance around the fact that patient.gender and gender identity are two very different things semantically, and that no incorrect assumption should be made about gender identity just because patient.gender is unknown. Undoing everything we've done in AU core around this just doesn't seem worth trouble when people's understanding just needs to change. That's my perspective.
So it raises the question, why did we actually make it mandatory in AU core anyway? Whereas if you have a value set that is required, and then you have a mandatory data element, that you are practically being forced to use that data element and that value set. And if you can't find anything suitable, then you have to use the value unknown, which is kind of anti-interoperability, if you may. So why did we actually do that in that sense?
We did that because all the national exchange specifications mandated gender. So AU core started from that basis and was done a walkthrough and a review. It's reported no problems from implementers that in terms of supporting an exchange specifications safely to provide the administrative gender field that's in systems. And so there is a native unknown that takes into account that. So it's been tested, this assumption. That's why it was proposed in the first place. And the conversations that were then had with implementers were that, yes, they do want to know this value every time it's there, and they were quite happy with it being mandatory.
So if you're looking at the meteor value set where you have three values which are very similar to the administrative gender value set, and there is the fourth one which is unspecified or inadequately described or defined, can't remember exactly. So this value is semantically quite different from the word unknown. If you look at dictionary definitions of unknown, it doesn't mean that it is inadequately specified or something like that. So in that regard, Meteor is one of the value sets that are required to be exchanged. So in the reporting sense, and if you're forcing people to use the HL7 administrative gender, then you are not able to accommodate other values, given that the value set binding is required. So I mean, I wouldn't say that the Meteor value set is sort of out of the ordinary. For what I know, say, for example, in the past experience that I worked with the Independent Hospital Pricing Authority, they use Meteor value set to report for costing purposes and to force people to use a value set which doesn't exactly match some of the national requirements. To me is anti-interoperability in my opinion.
Brett?
I think we're in the world of what does this administrative gender mean? Again, and I think it can mean any of the possible meanings in terms of like gender identity, sex assigned at birth, or any of those things. So and I think even in the resource it describes that. And if you want to be explicit about what you're describing, I think you should use the extensions that are provided. If you want to associate a recorded sex or gender with the patient.gender value, you should do that explicitly in the like the RSG extension and define that. I think we have advice that says that now.
But if you are using RSG extensions to define that, that's fine. Then your the patient.gender is mandatory with a required value set. You're then being forced to use unknown, and then I mean, as much as Ruben argued that it is well defined, then people shouldn't get confused about it. Semantically, people do get confused about it. It's already confused enough to have three or four things.
Yeah, I think the definition of patient.gender is pretty clear that you shouldn't be using it for other purposes than administrative purposes. So it's not, you shouldn't be interpreting it for anything clinical or anything. Yeah. So I think the extensions are trying to assess those problems and add to the information available. So yeah, that's it.
Okay, Ruben?
Yeah, look, I agree with what Brett said there, but I also wanted to challenge what Stephen was saying in relation to Meteor. The Meteor value domain for gender is not something that can be compared to FHIR patient.gender at all. The Meteor value domain is about gender identity, and it corresponds to the ABS standard for gender identity. That's why values like non-binary and so forth are in there. You should not be mapping from that value domain to patient.gender.
So therefore, as I said earlier, we are then compelled to use gender identity, and then so therefore the patient.gender will be populated with unknown. And to the uninitiated, you have two data items which have very similar in name, and then causing confusion. And then you have one you look at unknown, and then the other one you look at whatever value that people put in.
Exactly. The uninitiated shouldn't be dealing with this data if they don't understand it. So we can, and that's to my point at the beginning, we can provide guidance to clarify this for the uninitiated. Absolutely. But putting unknown there is the right thing to do in this case.
Well, I would debate that putting unknown is the right thing because it is not unknown. It is known, but then you're
It is
forcing
unknown.
people.
Gender identity is known. If administrative gender as defined by FHIR is unknown, then the value is unknown.
We'll go to Heath, and then if we have time, I also have a comment. Heath?
So I mean, there's lots of other descriptions around, but on that particular data element, there is no real description on it. It inherits from the base, which really just specifies the 4 codes. The binding does have some description on it, but that's the binding, not the description of the element. I wonder if we can just simply say administrative gender or something like that in our AU-based description, just to be absolutely clear.
Which we've linked to what this is, where we've taken, an intentional step there in AU base, not to replicate FHIR and instead point off to FHIR's content, which links off to the definition of administrative gender here.
I'm suggesting that we have 2 words in our description that says administrative gender.
Oh, you mean in the short of the profile?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Ruben?
Yeah, look, we can look at doing that, Heath. That's fine. I just wanted to flag that we have said explicitly in AU base that in line with the FHIR core spec, which requires IGs to be clear in what is meant by patient.gender, we have taken the stance that in AU base and all dependent IGs, patient.gender is to be regarded as a recorded sex or gender value. We've said that.
My last comment is just for Stephen, that with the obligations on AU core, and it depends on whether or not you want to supply patient.gender or not. Even if it's optional, if a system has an administrative gender, which I assume almost all systems do because they have their Medicare details and all that kind of thing, to be compliant to core, whether the cardinality changes to optional or not, they must supply the value, even if the element is optional. So it doesn't actually reduce, I would expect, the reality that even if you're not in a population health situation, a compliance system, if they're claiming core for compliance when reporting to Meteor, they have to supply that value. But that's up to the consuming system. They can ignore the things they don't need, and that's the expectation when dealing with core, that they'll only take the values they need in order to do their use case. But okay, so can I just get a summary? We're at time, sorry. So my summary is that we will go to AU core, and there will be an argument around whether or not this should be a cardinality choice to be made in AU core about use cases and that concept. I don't think there is. I think the discussion has been that it isn't a conflict for administrative gender to be unknown if a system doesn't know it, but that a system might know gender identity or sex assigned at birth. Is that where we've landed, to reaffirm that within AU base?
Sorry, can you say the AU base part again, Danielle? I missed that.
Sorry, I think we've reaffirmed the position in AU base that it isn't a conflict for a system to not know administrative gender, but to know sex assigned at birth or gender identity.
Yeah.
Okay. But there is still it is a valid question on whether or not patient.gender should be a cardinality of mandatory or optional that will be discussed at the AU core TDG.
And likewise, you could have the other way. You could have a known administrative gender while you've got an unknown sex assigned at birth and you've got an unknown gender identity.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's true. That is true.
Yeah, we're treating them as, I guess, sibling concepts. Okay, I think that answers that. And we've come to the end of time. We'll carry over the other agenda items we didn't get to. If there are other JIRAs that come up or that need to go on this agenda, please email Brett or put it in Zulip, and we'll go through that content at our next FHIR Work Group meeting. Okay, any other final comments or questions before we close? All right, thanks everyone. I'll stop that recording there and I'll see you in a fortnight.
Thank
Although
you.
some of you might be at
Thanks,
Dev
all.
Days, I guess.
Thanks, Danielle.
Thanks,
Thanks.
Bye.